All right, welcome back to Flat Six Innovations Research and Training Center. I'm here with Jake Ravey, the inventor, the initial guy that was able to develop a commercially available solution for retrofitting an M96, M97 engine with a different option bearing, so to speak. We talked about what an IMS shaft is, or what an IMS is. We talked about where the bearing resides and the location of it in the engine. We talked about the things that we can do to mitigate the possibility of a bearing failure. But even after all that, there is on occasion where a bearing does fail. Now, thankfully, it's not it was working and then all of a sudden it's not working situation. I think there's a range of failure that, Jake, I'll ask you to describe to our viewers that you've developed into, I believe, 4 stages.
Correct.
And how did you determine the 4? And what does it mean to an owner to catch their quote-unquote bearing failing at a 1, 2, 3, and 4 stage?
Well, unless somebody's actually attended my hands-on training and they've seen the presentation that I'm sharing a little bit of with you guys here, they may not have heard of the 4 stages of bearing failure. Now, I also want to kind of go over something that you touched on, because all too often the first 3 stages of this bearing failure are completely overlooked because they're silent. So somebody could actually have a failure that comes out of the blue. In most cases, IMS bearing failures to the operator of the vehicle have no precursor. There is no symptom, there is no smoke, there is no noise, there is no anything until you have an actual failure that is a catastrophic loss of the engine. So unfortunately, people just don't know what to look for, and we touched on that earlier in the segment.
And that's what we're trying to do now, is help,
Exactly.
help you build situational awareness.
That's right, and so you can understand why you're looking for the things we said later on to help you identify which stage you're at of failure. And maybe you're not at any stage, but at least you have those bits of information to figure it out.
And so what's the data? I know you've done a number of engine bearing replacements. Just to give our viewers an idea, what's your data set?
700 times we've retrofitted bearings, and those are engines that were still operational. Those were mostly elective jobs, because most of the time when you start having one of these stages of failure, you're going to fail my pre-qualification. I'm going to fail that engine. I'm not going to replace your bearing because I know the technology of mine that we employ is just going to fail again, because it's going to have debris-laden oil. It's going to get into the new bearing. It's going to cause other things to fail. So in that case, we have high standards, and we actually have a qualification process. I kind of make it akin to going in for a pre-op. If you're going to have some medical procedure done, you go in for a pre-op, they do blood work, they make sure you're not going to have a problem on the table while they're doing something else that's probably a lot less invasive.
Right.
That's the way it is with this. If we're going to go invasive with the engine, we want to make sure that the owner of the car is going to get a good return on investment from the money he's going to spend, or she's going to spend, to do the work, and that we're not going to have a bearing fail in service or some other component in the engine fail in service, which I found other things failing that were also symptomless in the same engine. So, most of the time we don't find problems, but when we do, we have to bring that up to the person and say, hey, we found this.
Right.
It's not a bad day for you. This is a really good day because we found it before you found it.
So take me through stage 1. What's it all about?
Stage 1 basically is, and we've got it pulled on the screen here, time in service, long oil service intervals, and contamination to the part, okay? So basically you have the seal on the bearing that starts to be attacked by long oil service intervals, oils that are mixed with other oils. Somebody doesn't keep the same brand. You're mixing things together. You're not staying on the same regimen of oil. There's some oils that can promote this as well. And then that actually leads to our outer seal beginning to harden, which makes it become brittle and begins to shrink. So the one in this photo here, you can see it has actually shrank. So around the outside diameter, that bearing actually has a gap. And that seal has begun to shrink, and it is letting oil get into that bearing.
Now, what's typically contained inside the bearing before this oil intrusion?
It is what we refer to as a permanent lubricated bearing. So the idea here is that a very high temperature grease is put in this bearing. It's packed in the bearing, almost like you would do a wheel bearing. Okay.
Yep.
And some wheel bearings are sealed. Okay. Some of them aren't. Typically, stuff in heavy equipment seal where you have a lot of debris and things like that. But in the idea behind it is you have a seal that protects that permanent lubrication and keeps it in place.
So in stage 1, the seal is basically broken, and now you'll have oil intrusion and mixing with that permanent lubrication. But everything that you've just mentioned, I wouldn't see that in my oil filter or in my...
At stage 1, you have no symptom at all. No matter how good you are with cutting oil filters open or whatever, you're not going to find this.
Okay.
This happens blindly. There's nothing that you're going to find, nothing you're going to do anyway to find this other than actually extracting the bearing and looking at it. Probably 90% of the engines that we've retrofitted and we've accepted to have a retrofit done and qualified are at stage 1.
Really?
Because at stage 1, we don't have debris-laden oil. We don't have any collateral damage. Nothing is extended from this bearing that's going to globally affect the rest of the engine. So stage 1, the bearing is just starting to get into a failure mode. So at this stage, I would take that bearing and I would retrofit it, and the car would live a good long life with any of the technologies that we would employ.
All right, Jake, so take me through stage 2. What are we looking for? What are we as owners going to be able to see when we're doing an oil change or a shop? What should they be looking for?
Vu, at stage 2, you still don't have anything that's really going to jump out at you. At stage 2, you're not going to hear any noises. A lot of people talk about a death rumble with an IMS bearing. I don't really hear that. I see a lot of cars coming in to me with failures going on. I don't hear that noise. It's not like a wheel bearing. It doesn't have a noise as a precursor a lot of times. Now, I will say that the engines that have the dual row bearings like this one, this bearing takes a lot longer to fail, which we're going to go over why that's a good and a bad thing. But it stays at its failure stages for a longer period of time. So this one, you might hear something if you're really paying attention at a drive-through, because I hear noises at drive-throughs all the time. You ever notice that? You pull up to a drive-through,
because it reverberates back into you.
You hear everything. You might hear that at a drive-through if you're paying attention to your car and you know what it's supposed to sound like.
Right.
Most people are disconnected and they just don't know. So, you might hear a noise, you might not at stage 2. But at stage 2, the bearing starts to degrade. You start having wear debris show up, and you could start seeing that in your oil, in your filter, and in the sump, in the magnetic drain plug. You could start to find some of that. I've got a car sitting downstairs right now that I told you about that came to me yesterday because it's a local owner and he did his own oil change and he found that, and it's here to be diagnosed.
At what point am I worried that that same amount of debris or a similar amount of debris has sort of spread all inside of my engine? Like, how do you make that call of, because if I just put a new bearing on and I hadn't cleaned out sort of the debris in the engine, I'm assuming that's still something that you would want to address.
Well, the thing is, if you have that question, you have to really sit down and go deeper in the engine. You have to assume nothing, quantify everything. If you find some debris, you have to find out where it comes from. Is it magnetic? Is it not magnetic? Size, color, quantity again. You have to understand that there's a lot of places in this engine where the debris is going to go and it's going to stay. And the only time it's going to come out and get back in the oil circulation is if the oil gets hot or if you have high RPM or something like that that's going to make that release get into the oil. So it can stay in nooks and crannies within the engine for a long time. So you have to think there's more there than what you've seen. That's why you pull the sump and you try to survey the scenario. You pull the filter, survey the scenario, look at the oil filter canister housing, all those things. Now, as far as making the call on what to do, that's why we've trained certified installers, and that's why people reach out to us to get that information if they find debris in their oil. And I invite anybody, if you have debris in your oil, go to Flat 6 Innovations. You can send us an email, give us some photos of it. I'll tell you what it is, more than likely. We've done this enough that we know size, color, and quantity from different things. Now, as any component in an engine wears, you're going to have debris stem from that wear. So there are normal bits of debris in size, color, and quantity.
And that's why we talked about why it's important that we have a reference point doing it regularly, so that if we see something and know, oh, that's kind of the typical amount versus whoa, this is probably twice the amount that I normally see when I do an oil change.
Absolutely. And that's why, if you understand these stages, and that's why we're going over the things in the stages, like here, we see that at stage 2, we have engine oil washing the debris out of the bearing. So now that seal is still in place, but the seal has failed enough that oil is getting into the bearing and it's washing the debris that's generated in the bearing back out and getting it in the oil supply. Okay.
So when it does that, I'm assuming the lifetime grease or oil that was in there is also being pushed out.
It's been gone at that point,
So
because it was already gone at stage 1.
Ah, okay.
You see. So, and of course here, at that point, you have your ferromagnetic debris, because everything in this bearing is ferromagnetic. There's a myth out there that there's copper in this bearing. There's no copper in the bearing. So it's all going to show up as iron in an oil sample. Everything with that bearing is going to show up as iron in an oil sample. So then, you've got the oil entering the bearing. It washes through and it creates that fuzz. So the tiniest stuff you see in the oil is what we refer to as ferromagnetic fuzz. Now, people a lot of times, and this is a huge, huge thing that I deal with, people have a kind of an assumption that little small debris isn't a big deal. Well, folks, I have to tell you, it's the worst possible thing for contamination that you can have, because it is very light and it will suspend itself in the oil. So basically, it suspends itself in the oil. The oil is circulated, and it will travel throughout the entire engine. So you have liquid sandpaper, if you will, traveling through the engine. And it will destroy cylinders. It'll take out piston rings. It'll take out rod bearings, and that's, all the different bearings in the engine. It'll take out the IMS bearing even further. So that little tiny debris, the stuff that's even microscopic sometimes, is what we look for. In the microscopic stuff, you can only find with used oil analysis, because if it's over a certain micron count, the human eye won't see it. So, that's the idea there, is if you have a stage 2 bearing failure and you think that something's starting to go on and you start finding a small fuzz, well, you still have to take that seriously. Those small pieces a lot of times do more damage to other components than bigger pieces do.
Okay, well, thank you, Jake, for taking us through stage 1 and stage 2. And to me, so far, it's been pretty benign in terms of what you're finding in the filters, in your sump, etc., with regards to the failure of the bearing. But now we get into stage 3. And stage 3 might not be for the squeamish, but I think it's important for us to see what happens in what you call a stage 3. So take it from here.
Well, Vu, stage 3 is where you really need to buckle up and hold on, like you said, because at this point, the person doing an IMS retrofit procedure or the person changing their oil or whatever is going to have to make some decisions based on how much of the debris they're finding, where it's at, how big the pieces are again, the size, color, quantity thing. And really at this point, one of our certified installers is not going to be able to qualify a car for an IMS retrofit. And the reason why is because the amount of debris that's harmful in the engine has elevated to a point where we do not feel it's safe to risk that customer's money for the entire engine or the product to basically go in and do it. At this point, we're talking about a kind of a proactive type of a retrofit where we think we don't have a problem, but we're going to go in and electively do it. So that's proactive. Honestly, stage 3 is reactive, because we are already having a sizable failure and we have to go into a reactive mode. We are honestly going into a repair mode. We are no longer at the proactive stage. So realistically, at stage 3, we've got big time wear happening to the balls and to the cages within the bearing. And the erosion, the spalling, all these things have occurred at a great rate. And as the wear begins, more wear follows that. As you have more wear debris, that creates more wear. It's really a snowball that's just starting to snowball. And it's not snowballing to a good effect. So you have a lot of debris creating wear. That wear is also creating vibration. So a lot of times we see the only symptom of an IMS bearing failure before the bearing actually fails is an oil leak. So these engines have a rear main seal problem, or RMS, okay? These days, RMS to me is blown way out of proportion. That happened in the early days. Most of these cars, we haven't seen a rear main seal failure in a long time. Most cars have already had the rear main seal replaced that had a problem
With the
and-
upgraded
with the
version.
upgraded part. So that's kind of yesterday's news, except if somebody has a very low mileage car and it's an early one. And that's
With the
one reason-
original seal.
Exactly, and that's one reason why low mileage cars don't really turn me on.
Mm.
You know, I see a lot of problems from the cars that weren't driven. So, you know, sorry, your 10,000 mile car really doesn't impress me. I would rather have an 80,000 mile car. It's more proven. That's me. But long story short, the reason why we see these oil leaks is because the vibration that comes from this bearing starting to wear.
Not being centered.
Exactly,
into-
it's not centered anymore, and that's creating a harmonic that then will kill the O-ring that seals up the bearing flange, and you have a oil leak. And that oil leak comes between the transmission and engine bell housing area. It looks just like a rear main seal. It is often assumed to be a rear main seal, but when you see that leakage, you have to start thinking, I have an IMS bearing problem.
Investigate further because
Yes.
it's probably not the seal. Because, like you said, there's been many versions of the seal that have been upgraded that's been very robust. But if you're experiencing a leak, that it might be your IMS.
If
bearing.
someone knew what I know and they saw that leak, they would go straight into the mindset of I have an IMS bearing failing, and it's at stage 3.
So at stage 3, you're not just contemplating whether or not you're going to replace a bearing. Obviously, you can do that, but the bigger question is just replacing the bearing worth it? Because you have, from the failure of the original bearing, you may have taken out other components within the engine that if you don't properly clean or go through and capture all of those bits from the previous failure, putting a brand new bearing in a motor that's quote unquote dirty, still not a good thing.
No, and it's going to lead to a disappointing situation. And you just can't clean the oil enough. I know one shop that's changed oil in a car 15 times before they gave the car back to the owner. The bearing lasted a year, and the replacement bearing started to fail because the debris just could not be removed.
You know, a customer will say, okay, yes, my bearing, or let's say they come to an agreement that the original bearing has failed. They know that a bearing replacement is a solution, even though the mechanic may say, well, we don't know where the rest of the debris is, but the dollar amount to take apart and properly go through that engine, I would imagine, is not cheap. So therefore, the owner might just go, you know what? I'm just going to replace the bearing and then gamble on whether or not, you know, what's gone through my engine's going to take out this new bearing.
And unfortunately, Vu, we have situations where there are times where a shop will have a customer demand that they want the bearing changed. The shop finds the debris, they bring it to their attention, they do everything right. The customer, who is assumed to always be right, tells the shop,
just change
no, you're going to change the bearing, I'm going to buy whatever bearing and you're going to put it in the engine, and they do that. And that is a bad situation. And all too often it's because they want to take the car and trade it in.
So Jake, you had talked about the stages of the bearing failure, but depending on the type of bearing that you have, the duration of the stages are different.
Especially for stage 3. So basically, with our stage 3 bearing failure, Vu, we have a situation where the single row bearing has some pros and some cons, and so does the dual row. So basically, as you notice here, the dual row bearing literally is twice as large and has twice as many wear components as the single row. So what this means is the single row bearing is going to go ahead and jump straight to stage 4 failure much quicker than a dual row.
But it has less components in it.
That's why.
Okay.
The less components, less structure, and it basically fails quicker because it does not have as much support. So I actually can consider that a pro. One might look at it and say, how can you consider it jumping to full failure to be a good thing? Well, it's simple. The fact that this does not expel as much of wear debris as the other bearing does. So even though you've got failure, now you're already at stage 3, you have a repair, you're taking this engine apart, you have collateral damage at this point from debris, so you're pulling it apart. At this point in time, what matters most is the collateral damage and the extent of that, and nothing does more collateral damage than wear debris. So if you can go ahead and jump straight to stage 4 failure, that's the pro of the single row bearing. It also is the bearing that's the most apt to fail, like we talked about earlier. Now, the dual row bearing, it has twice as many balls, has twice as many cages, twice as many races, twice as much wear. So it has twice as many wear components. So it will expel into the engine's oil 2 times the amount of wear debris of a single row. The issue with the dual row bearing, it stays at stage 3 failure too long. And because of that, you put a lot more debris in the oil, it destroys a lot more other things in the engine. I've seen dual row bearings fail and get to the point where the bearing was still together. It really wasn't at stage 4 yet. It was almost there. But it put enough metal into the oil that it wiped out all the camshaft journals, wiped out the journals in the cylinder heads where the camshafts ride. And these things are at the end of the extremities of the engine, all the way at the outside. They're the last thing where the oil would end up with debris-laden oil would be there. So in that situation, I had to throw the cylinder heads away. There was no way to fix it. So the dual row bearing has always been assumed to be heavier duty, and yes, it is. But if you have a failure of a dual row bearing, you can expect your collateral damages to be
Far
much
worse.
greater in respect to foreign object debris.
Unfortunately, there is a last stage, and that stage is stage 4. And what are we looking at stage 4?
Well, stage 4 is where the engine experiences a complete and total catastrophic loss. No, that does not mean that it can't be rebuilt, or it can't be overhauled or reconstructed, as I coined the term. What that means is you're taking the entire engine apart, you're cleaning all this debris out with ultrasonics and other methods that we have in today's world, and we're going to address all those wear items, we're going to update things, and we're going to start from scratch. And you're not going to be able to just go in and, like some shops do, and cut out the old bearing races and try to put a new bearing in. You've got way too much collateral damage to allow that to happen. You know, it's the end of the line. Stage 4, it's done. And a lot of times, your stage 4 will have a huge loss of oil as well. The car will come in on a rollback truck, and the whole bottom of the car is covered in oil. The rollback's covered in oil, and it's because there's a hole the size of your pinky in the IMS bearing flange. And the stud that controls the IMS bearing, holds it in place against the flange, has broken from the vibration at stage 3. That opens up an orifice to the engine's oil supply, and oil dumps out. So if you've had that occurrence where you kind of have, some people say that they hear marbles in a tin can, and the engine shuts off and all the lights light up like a Christmas tree, and then you have a loss of oil, please do not try to start that car back. You have experienced an IMS bearing failure. If you try to start the car back, the extensive collateral damage is going to escalate.
Right,
you're going to have much more bent valves and many more bent rods and pistons damaged and everything else in the engine. You're going to have a massive amount more damage. It's the natural thing for the engine to shut off and people try to restart it, but please do not do this. You're costing yourself hundreds or thousands of dollars with every turn of the key. A lot of times we have this happen. The engine will end up at stage 4 as it decelerates, as it slows down. Because, like we said earlier, the bearing loads are higher at idle speeds and under deceleration than they are at cruise speed or acceleration. It's just the way that the ball bounces with this. So I have people call me up and they say, I was pulling into, and I say, a parking spot, and all of a sudden the engine stalled. And you tried to restart it and it wouldn't do it, and you looked under the car and you had a puddle of oil. And they say, how in the world did you take the words out of my mouth? Or they say, I was coming off the interstate, and I say, you were decelerating down the exit ramp, the engine stalled, you didn't think anything about it, you tried to start it back and it wouldn't start. How did you take the words out of my mouth? You know, or I was pulling up to a gas pump, and I take the words out of their mouth again. I've dealt with this thousands of times with the same phone calls. And it always happens with a car slowing down in most cases, not every case. So those are the instances where if you watch this video, please, under no circumstance, try to start that car back. The good news is that if it happens at low speed, usually the collateral damage is limited. And you may not have that much collateral damage. You're still stage 4, you're still taking it apart. But as soon as you touch that starter one more time, the things we see behind us start to happen even greater, where pistons and valves collide. You know, you have bent valves, you have broken valves, you have valves going through the tops of pistons, you have those balls being expelled everywhere. Some of this damage was done because somebody didn't know not to try to start it back.
All right, so you've stomached through, you've gotten through stage 1 through 4, but let me reset you. We're taking you through the different stages, and as you mentioned earlier, in stage 1 and 2, there's a lot of things that you can look out for. Again, situational awareness, it seems to be the key phrase here. So in our next segment, we're gonna go through the different options that are available in the market so that you can see what you can do with the different IMS bearings, solutions out there, and then you can make an informed decision of which path you want to take. So stay tuned.